Before dawn, the ground itself seemed to breathe. Each detonation from the Ottoman gun sent a slow, rolling shock through the earth beneath the Theodosian walls, as if the city were alive and struggling to hold itself together. Stone dust drifted through the air in thick, choking clouds. Men shouted orders they could barely hear. Somewhere in the darkness, masonry finally gave way, and the sound carried with it truth no one inside Constantinople could ignore anymore. The walls were failing. For nearly 11 centuries, these fortifications had stood between Europe and the armies of the East. They had stopped Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Rus, and countless others. But now, in the spring of 1453, they were being methodically dismantled by gunpowder and iron under the direction of a 21-year-old sultan who understood that warfare had changed. This was not simply another siege. It was the last battle of the Roman Empire. Constantinople was once the greatest city in the known world, the beating heart of imperial administration, trade, and culture. By the mid-15th century, it had been reduced to a hollow shell of its former self. Vast districts lay abandoned, fields growing inside the walls where dense neighborhoods once stood. The population, once measured in hundreds of thousands, had collapsed to perhaps 50,000 souls. The empire that ruled from this city had been shrinking for centuries, battered by civil wars, economic decline, and foreign invasions. What remained was a capital without an empire, a crown without an army. At its head stood Constantine XI Palaiologos, the last Roman emperor. He was not a ceremonial ruler, clinging to ancient titles. He was a soldier, hardened by years of fighting in the Peloponnese, fully aware of the strategic reality he faced. Constantine knew that Constantinople could not be saved by diplomacy or divine intervention. If the city fell, it would fall by force of arms, and he would be there when it happened. Outside the walls waited Mehmed II, Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. Young, disciplined, and obsessively focused, Mehmed had prepared for this campaign with a clarity that alarmed even his own advisors. He had rebuilt the Ottoman fleet, tightened control of the Bosphorus by constructing the fortress of Janissary, and, most importantly, invested heavily in artillery. Mehmed understood what previous attackers had not. The walls of Constantinople were not invincible. They were simply obsolete. The centerpiece of his siege train was the great bombard, cast by the engineer Urban. It was an enormous bronze cannon, capable of firing stone balls weighing hundreds of kilograms. The weapon was slow to load and prone to cracking, but its psychological and physical impact was devastating. Each shot struck the walls like an earthquake, opening fissures that Byzantine engineers could only patch temporarily with rubble and timber. The defenders were painfully few. Estimates placed the total garrison at no more than 7,000 to 8,000 men. They were a mixture of Byzantine soldiers, local militia, and foreign mercenaries, most notably the Genoese under Giovanni Giustiniani Longo. Every section of wall required far more men than were available. Commanders were forced to gamble, shifting troops constantly, hoping the Ottomans would not find the weak point before dawn. The strategic problem was simple and brutal. The Ottomans could attack everywhere. The Byzantines could defend almost nowhere. The land walls stretched for miles, and every breach created by artillery demanded immediate repair, often under fire. At night, work crews filled gaps with earth and broken stone, knowing full well that the cannons would reopen them the next day. At sea, the situation was a little better. A massive chain blocked the entrance to the Golden Horn, preventing the Ottoman fleet from entering the harbor. For a brief moment, this gave the defenders hope. That hope died when Mehmed ordered his ships hauled overland, dragged on greased timbers across the hills of Galata, and launched directly into the harbor behind Chain. The maneuver stunned the defenders. It was a clear demonstration that the Ottomans were not only strong, but adaptive. Inside the city, morale eroded steadily. Food supplies dwindled. Sleep became rare. Every man on the walls knew that relief from the west was unlikely to arrive in time, if at all. Appeals to Rome and the major European powers had produced little more than promises and prayers. Political divisions, religious disputes, and sheer distance had ensured that Constantinople would stand alone. Yet the defense held. Assault after assault was repelled. Greek fire flared along the walls. Arquebuses cracked in the darkness. Crossbow bolts and arrows rained down on attackers struggling through ditches and rubble. In close combat, the defenders fought with the desperation of men who understood there was no retreat. Emperor Constantine himself was frequently seen on the walls, encouraging troops, sharing their risks, reinforcing the idea that this was not just a military defense, but a final stand for an entire civilization. Mehmed watched, measured, and adjusted. He abandoned costly frontal attacks in favor of mining operations, attempting to collapse the walls from below. Byzantine counterminers listened through the earth, digging desperately to intercept Ottoman tunnels. Underground clashes erupted in darkness, fought with knives, fire, and suffocating smoke. Every day added pressure. Every night shortened the defenders' endurance. By late May, the situation had become critical. The walls near the gate of St. Romanus had absorbed the heaviest punishment. Cracks widened faster than they could be repaired. Justiniani's men bore the brunt of the fighting there, their discipline and armor making them the backbone of the defense. But even elite troops have limits, and casualties mounted relentlessly. Both commanders understood what was coming. Men prepared a final, decisive assault, carefully structured in waves. The defenders sensed it too. Priests held last services. Soldiers wrote final messages, knowing many would never leave the walls alive. Constantine XI spent the night before the attack moving through the city, speaking commanders and civilians alike, asking forgiveness for any wrongs, reaffirming his resolve to die as a Roman emperor should. The empire had been shrinking for centuries. Now it was being compressed into a single line of stone and exhausted men, waiting in the darkness as the cannons fell silent. Not because the siege was ending, but because the final storm was about to begin. Silence settled over the battlefield in the early hours of May 29th, 1453, an unnatural pause that every veteran on the walls recognized as more dangerous than bombardment. The Ottoman guns, which had thundered day and night for weeks, fell quiet not because they were spent, but because their work was finished. The breaches they had carved into the Theodosian walls were now wide enough for infantry to exploit. In the darkness before dawn, Mehmed II issued his final orders. The assault would come in waves, each designed to exhaust the defenders further. First would go the irregulars, lightly armed troops meant to probe, bleed, and die if necessary. Behind them would follow the Anatolian infantry, disciplined and better equipped. Only when the defenders were fully committed, disorganized, and depleted would Mehmed unleash his Janissaries, the professional corps of his army. It was a calculated plan, grounded in an understanding of morale, as much as terrain. When the attack began, it did not start with a single shout or trumpet blast, but with movement everywhere at once. Ladders rose from the ditches. Drums beat in overlapping rhythms. Shouts in dozens of languages filled the darkness. The first attackers surged toward the breaches near the gate of St. Romanus, where the walls had been reduced to fractured stone and packed earth. The defenders met them with everything they had left. Arquebuses flashed at close range, their smoke hanging low along the ramparts. Crossbows snapped, spears thrust downward into massive bodies pressing against the wall. Greek fire flared in sudden, terrifying bursts, igniting men and equipment alike. The first wave broke, leaving the ground slick with blood and broken gear. But there was no relief, no pause. Another wave followed almost immediately. Hour by hour, the pressure mounted. The defenders were no longer rotating or resting. Every man was in place, fighting continuously. Giovanni Giustiniani, commanding the most critical sector, moved along the breach, directing counterattacks, reinforcing weak points, keeping cohesion where chaos threatened to take over. His presence mattered. The men trusted him, and trust was now a weapon as valuable as steel. Then came the moment that would tip the balance. Giustiniani was struck by a shot. Accounts differ whether it was an arrow or projectile from an early firearm, but the wound was serious enough to remove him from the fight. As he was carried from the wall, the psychological effect was immediate. His men hesitated. Orders became confused. Gaps opened where none could be afforded. Mehmed saw it. The Janissaries advanced. These were not irregulars rushing forward on momentum alone. They moved in formation, shields overlapping, officers maintaining control amid the chaos. They pressed into the breach with discipline, forcing the defenders back step by step. Close combat followed, brutal and exhausting. Swords, axes, and spears were used at arm's length. Men slipped on rubble and bodies, dragged down and finished in seconds. Emperor Constantine XI was there, not directing from a distance, but fighting alongside his soldiers. By this point, the situation was beyond recovery. The defensive line had fractured. Somewhere in the confusion, a small postern gate may have been left open or forced, allowing Ottoman troops to enter the city in greater numbers. The precise detail matters less than the result. The walls were compromised beyond repair. As Janissary banners appeared atop the ramparts, the meaning was clear. Constantine is said to have removed the imperial insignia from his armor, refusing to be recognized or captured. He drew his sword and charged into the fighting near the breach. There would be no surrender, no negotiated end. The last Roman emperor died as a soldier, somewhere amid the press of bodies, his exact fate unrecorded, his stand absolute. By mid-morning, organized resistance collapsed. Ottoman troops poured into Constantinople through multiple points. Fighting continued in isolated pockets, but the outcome was decided. After nearly 1,100 years, the Roman Empire had ceased to exist, not with ceremony or proclamation, but with the fall of exhausted men defending broken walls. Mehmed II entered the city later that day. Contrary to later myths of unchecked destruction, he quickly moved to impose order. Looting was curtailed. Key structures were secured. When he rode to Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral that had symbolized imperial and religious authority for centuries, he ordered it converted into a mosque, a deliberate act marking the transfer of power and beginning of a new era. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves far beyond its walls. In Europe, it was received with a mixture of horror, disbelief, and resignation. Militarily, it confirmed what many had already suspected. Medieval fortifications could not withstand sustained artillery fire. Strategically, it shifted trade routes and power balances. Culturally, the flight of Greek scholars westward carried ancient texts and knowledge that would help fuel the Renaissance. For the Ottomans, Constantinople became Istanbul, their imperial capital, a center of administration, trade, and culture. Mehmed II earned the title the Conqueror, securing his place in history as one of the most formidable rulers of his age. For the Romans, there was no successor state waiting in the wings, no counteroffensive, no recovery. What remained was memory, scholarship, and the example of final stand made not in hope of victory, but in refusal to disappear quietly. The last battle of the Roman Empire was not defined by a single charge or heroic speech. It was defined by endurance, by adaptation, and by the moment when centuries of tradition collided with the realities of modern warfare. Stone walls, religious faith, and inherited prestige could not stop cannon fire, disciplined infantry, and commander willing to innovate. Constantine XI received no monument raised by his successors, no empire to preserve his name. Yet his legacy endures precisely because he fought knowing the outcome, choosing duty over survival, and resistance over surrender. In that choice, the Roman Empire ended not in decay, but in defiance. If this story moved you at the fall of an empire and the men who stood at its end still resonate, support the channel, share the story, and keep these battles alive, because history only fades when we stop remembering it.